I was the daughter who mailed silence in envelopes. The one who kept the lights on, not just in their house, but in the myth of who they thought they were, self-sufficient, proud, never in need. I let them believe that myth for years. Until one Sunday afternoon, standing beneath the low-slung ceiling of our family's cramped living room, it unraveled in the most humiliating way. "You only sent $1, my father barked, his voice a thunderclap that silenced the chatter around the buffet table. We were celebrating my mother's birthday, though there was no joy in the air. Just the usual tension, baked into every dish, every sidelong glance. I had arrived late, as I often did, clutching a modest bouquet of grocery store lilies and an envelope with a handwritten note. I placed it among the sea of expensive gift bags that bore Jessica's name. Jessica, my sister, the golden daughter, the favored one. She arrived in a tailored coat, hair shining like an advertisement, lips glossed into a perfect lie of warmth. My parents doted on her, surrounding her like planets to her sun. They believed everything she told them. They also believed everything she never corrected. When the conversation turned to family contributions, of course it did. It always did. My father held up a bank slip with a trembling hand. "Jessica sends $8,000 a month," he declared, looking around the room for admiring nods. I stood still, heart quietly breaking open in my chest. Because those transfers? Every single one had come from me. That was me, I said, barely more than a whisper. My mother, perched on the edge of her throne-like armchair, narrowed her eyes. "Stop stealing her credit," she snapped. And just like that, years of silent giving collapsed in a single sentence. The weight of sacrifice, the months of skipping my own rent, the nights I ate canned soup to make sure their mortgage was paid, it all disintegrated into dust. I said nothing more. I couldn't. The wound wasn't just fresh, it was surgical. Clean. Precise. They hadn't just overlooked me. They had carved me out of their reality entirely. That night, I stopped every automatic transfer. Every wire, every standing order. The next morning, my inbox filled with balance alerts and overdue notices. I read each one with strange calm, like someone watching the tide reclaim a castle made of sand. The next month, I found out the truth. Not through a phone call. No one reached out. Not my mother, not my father, and certainly not Jessica. But the universe has a way of speaking when you've finally gone quiet. A letter came. Not in a pastel envelope with hearts or sentiment. A white, official thing. Tidy, impersonal. From the power company. Addressed to me, though I hadn't lived there in over a decade. Inside was a notice. Services disconnected. Outstanding balance, $4,739.38. My father had added my name to the utility accounts years ago, for emergencies, he'd said. I was the emergency. Always. But this time, I let the silence grow teeth. I didn't call. I didn't offer help. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine I could finally afford and opened a new document on my laptop. Its title? The Cost of Being Forgotten. To be continued. I didn't set out to write a memoir. Not in the traditional sense. There were no grand intentions, no agent pitches or outlines, no dreams of publishing. It started as a survival instinct, a place to put the rage without setting fire to my own sanity. A place to finally tell my side without being talked over, told I was too sensitive, or reminded how much worse it could be. The document grew by the hour. What began with the utility notice unfurled into chapters, each memory rising like dust disturbed by a long-forgotten storm. I chronicled the small betrayals, the erasures, the years of being told I was so independent, only to realize it was code for, "We know you'll survive without our help, so we won't offer any." Jessica was never expected to survive. She was expected to shine. I thought of the first transfer I made. I was 23, freshly employed and barely surviving in a studio apartment with paper-thin walls and a leaky faucet. I had $347 in savings when my mother called me in tears. "We're going to lose the house," she'd said. Jessica's tuition drained everything. Just until your father's bonus clears. I wired $2,000 that night. They never lost the house. My father's bonus came through 2 weeks later. No one mentioned the transfer again. I convinced myself it was love. That helping was what daughters did. I did it again and again and again every month for 9 years. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without credit. Jessica, meanwhile, lived like someone who had never needed to think about consequences. Her social media feeds were full of champagne brunches, weekend spa retreats, and inspirational captions about self-care. And yet, somehow, my parents believed she was the one supporting them. She never corrected them. That was the part that hurt the most. I didn't expect the fallout to be immediate after I stopped the transfers. But then came the phone call. It was a Thursday morning, gray and dull, the kind of sky that forgets to rain. I was halfway through my oatmeal when my phone lit up. Mom. I stared at it, the way one might regard a wasp trapped behind glass. I let it go to voicemail. The second call came an hour later. Then a third. By the fourth, my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Clara. Your mom's been trying to reach you. Something about the bank. Everything okay? Clara, the only family member who had ever seen me clearly. We had grown close in college, trauma-bonded by the quiet indignities of being the responsible girls in families that praised chaos as charm. They're in trouble, she wrote again. But I think you already know that. I did. But it wasn't my job to fix it anymore. That weekend, Jessica posted a cryptic Instagram story, a dimly lit shot of wine glasses clinking, captioned, "Learning who really has your back." The irony made me laugh out loud. I wanted to write her a letter, list out every payment, attach receipts and dates like a trial lawyer with something to prove. But I didn't. She wouldn't read it. Or worse, she would, and find a way to make herself the victim. Instead, I kept writing my own version. Quietly. Powerfully. And I made a decision. I was going to buy a house. Not for them. Not for show. For me. Something small. Something mine. A place where no one would knock unannounced, demanding I give up pieces of myself for the comfort of others. That Sunday, I toured a cottage on the edge of town. The real estate agent talked about resale value, nearby schools, and updated plumbing. I nodded along, distracted by the creak in the floorboards and the way sunlight pooled in the kitchen window like a blessing. I imagined myself there. No more erasure. No more silent sacrifices. No more applause reserved for the wrong daughter. For once, I was going to choose myself. To be continued, I made the offer on the cottage the next morning. Cash. I'd never spent money like that before, boldly, without second-guessing, without explaining. For years, every dollar I earned had been filtered through the lens of obligation. Rent first, then savings, then Jessica's tuition shortfall. Their medical bills. Their home repairs. Their just until we're back on our feet emergencies that somehow never ended. Now, the money was mine again. And I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. The realtor called me that afternoon. They accepted. No counter. I sat there in stunned silence, phone still pressed to my ear after the call ended. I looked around my tiny apartment, at the second-hand couch I'd reupholstered myself, the bookshelves bowed from the weight of other people's stories. And I whispered out loud, to no one, I did this. Not for them. For me. That night, I celebrated with takeout Thai food, the kind with too much spice and no apologies. I poured myself a glass of wine and toasted the empty space. To invisible daughters and their undeniable rise. 2 days later, the phone calls resumed. Blocked numbers. My father's landline. Jessica's assistant. I ignored everyone. Then came the letter. Not from my family, but from the bank. It arrived folded crisply, smelling of printer ink and desperation. The house I had once helped them save was now in foreclosure. The irony didn't escape me. I had pulled them back from the edge so many times, they'd forgotten how to stand on their own. I read the letter once, then again, slower this time. I traced the figures, the missed payments, the mounting debt. And then I saw it my name, not as a cosigner, not as a reference, as a guarantor. Years ago, I'd signed a document my mother handed me on Christmas Eve. Just tax stuff, she'd said, smiling over a cup of peppermint cocoa. I was 26 and exhausted from working a double shift. I'd signed it without reading, too tired to imagine betrayal wearing a holiday sweater. I felt the heat rise in my throat now. Betrayal isn't always a knife in the back. Sometimes, it's a paper trail in your own handwriting. I called Clara. She picked up on the second ring. "I've been waiting for this," she said before I could speak. She came over with coffee and her laptop. Clara worked in compliance at a credit union. She understood fine print better than most attorneys. We sat on my floor, documents spread around us like a battlefield. "You're not liable," she finally said, pointing to a clause buried in paragraph 7. "They never finalized the guarantee with your approval signature. They forged the rest." I should have cried. I should have screamed. Instead, I laughed. Not out of humor. Out of recognition. They had written me out of their hearts, but kept my name on their lifeboat. No more. Clara helped me draft a letter. Clean. Legal. Final. I sent it registered mail. 3 days later, my father showed up at my door. He looked smaller than I remembered. Stooped. Less a man, more a monument to past authority. "I thought we were family," he said. "We were," I replied. "But family doesn't use your silence as a currency." He tried to step inside. I blocked the door. "I bought a house," I told him, softly. "My house, paid for with the pieces you didn't want." He didn't respond. Just stood there, caught between pride and defeat. I closed the door gently. The lock clicked like punctuation at the end of a sentence I'd waited years to finish. To be continued. The door stayed closed. He never knocked again. In the quiet that followed, I discovered something surprising. Peace is not the absence of noise, but the reclamation of your own sound. For years, the background hum of obligation had filled every hour. Now there was silence, and it was deafening in the best possible way. I moved into the cottage 3 weeks later. Clara helped me carry boxes. We drank lemonade on the porch, her feet kicked up on the railing like we were girls again, dreaming of futures where we weren't always holding someone else's ladder. "This is your season," she said, tapping her glass to mine. I nodded, unsure how to name the feeling inside me. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something quieter, more sacred. Like planting roots after a long winter. The first night in the house, I lit every candle I owned. I cooked myself a meal, not leftovers, not takeout, real food with real flavor. I set the table for one, with cloth napkins and a glass of wine that didn't come from the clearance bin. I was no longer a daughter in the traditional sense. I was something else now. A woman who had learned that silence can be both sanctuary and scream. The next morning, I woke early, sunlight pouring in through linen curtains like a benediction. I took my coffee on the porch, notebook in hand. Not the memoir, this was something new. The beginning of something else. A guide, maybe? Or a collection of letters. Stories for other women like me, those who gave too much and received too little. Those who'd been erased so thoroughly that even their generosity was credited to someone else. I thought of titling it The Other Daughter. But as I scribbled ideas, I realized no. I wasn't the other anything anymore. I was me. The following week brought more silence from my family. Not even Jessica's polished passive aggression graced my inbox. It was a relief, but also a confirmation. I'd become invisible the moment I stopped being useful. Let them look through me, I thought. I've built a home they can't enter not because I locked them out, but because they were never willing to see me in the first place. Clara sent me a link to a women's financial workshop. "You should speak," she said. "Tell your story." I laughed. "You know I hate public speaking." "You hated confrontation too," she replied, "but you're rewriting that story." So I did. My first talk was to a group of 20 women in a church basement. Some were my age, some older. One woman wept during the Q&A. Another hugged me so tightly afterward I could feel her ribs shake. It spread from there. An invitation here. A podcast there. A guest essay for a major outlet. Each time I spoke, I felt less like the forgotten daughter and more like someone whose scars were maps for others. I wasn't healing in isolation anymore. I was building something bigger than pain, deeper than betrayal. A movement made of quiet women who finally dared to speak. The first time I saw my name in print, I didn't cry. I expected I would, years of invisibility culminating in this small but seismic shift. But instead, I stared at the byline with a stillness so deep it felt like reverence. There it was, Elena Moore. Not Jessica's sister. Not Richard's daughter. Just me. The essay had been titled Inheritance of Absence, and it told the story of quiet daughters and the unacknowledged economies they support. It struck a nerve. Emails poured in from strangers, women with similar stories, with quieter forms of erasure. Some had funded siblings' educations. Others had been emotional anchors for parents who never asked about their dreams. All of them carried the ache of being needed but never cherished. "You spoke for us," one message read. I didn't even know how much I needed to hear it until I did. And with that, the shame I had carried began to transmute into something sturdier, solidarity. By autumn, I'd been invited to speak at a women's leadership summit. A larger audience this time. Microphones, stage lights, a teleprompter if I needed it. I wrote my speech longhand in my cottage's sunroom, the late October sun casting golden shadows across the floor. It opened like this. There's a kind of woman who holds up her family like scaffolding, who is praised for her strength but punished the moment she falters, who is called independent as an excuse for why she's left alone. I was that woman, until I stopped confusing silence with grace. The applause came like rain after a long drought. Not loud, but consistent. Steady. I smiled and curtsied slightly, an old, ironic habit, and walked off stage lighter than I'd felt in years. A week later, my mother sent a text. "Mom, we saw the video. Your father is very hurt. So am I. Why would you air private family matters like that?" I stared at the message. No mention of my words. No recognition. No apology. Just control, veiled in shame. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The next day, Clara forwarded me a screenshot of Jessica's latest social post. A glossy portrait of her in front of a luxury SUV, captioned, "Self-made and proud of it. Hustle beats handouts every time." I nearly laughed. Let them cling to their illusions. I was no longer funding them, financially, emotionally, or otherwise. And I wasn't alone. The stories I was hearing, the women I was meeting, they were part of something bigger. A tide was shifting. The final turn came at a panel discussion in New York. Afterward, a woman in a tailored blazer approached me. She introduced herself as an editor at a major publishing house. "I think you've got a book in you," she said, handing me her card. "And I think the world needs to read it." I took the card slowly, fingers trembling. Not because I was afraid, but because, for the first time, I believed her. I walked home that evening under a city sky full of noise and possibility. This was no longer just my story. It was an anthem. The book deal came faster than I anticipated. 6 months after that chance encounter in New York, I was sitting across from my editor in a sunlit office lined with shelves of stories that had already changed the world. I remember glancing at the spines, memoirs, essays, manifestos, and wondering where mine would fit. Whether it would. "We're thinking uncredited as the title," she said, smiling. "Feels sharp." "True." I nodded, the word echoing through me like a bell. It captured everything, my role in the family's myth-making, the invisibility cloak they draped over me, and how I'd finally set it down. Writing the manuscript was like opening doors I'd once bricked over. Each chapter asked me to revisit moments I'd buried, The night I pulled from my rent savings to pay their overdue electric bill, Jessica's birthday party where I cooked and cleaned and wasn't even in a single photo. The Christmas I spent alone because I'd said no just once. But for every painful excavation, there was also reclamation. The late-night laughs with Clara as we fact-checked timelines, the reader letters I taped to the wall when my hands trembled at the keyboard, and the growing understanding that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every woman who'd given too much and been thanked too little. The day the book cover was finalized, I stood in my cottage's kitchen holding a printed mock-up. A black background, my name in white, and at the center, a single word. Uncredited. I wept not because I was sad, but because the girl who once quietly signed checks and never dared sign her own name to her contributions was finally being seen. The publisher planned a modest tour, independent bookstores, college campuses, women's leadership events. I didn't care about the size. Every room I stepped into held someone who needed to hear the story. And I spoke for her. After one reading in Minneapolis, a woman approached me in tears. "My daughter sent me this book," she said. "I read it in one night. I didn't realize. I didn't see what I was doing to her until I saw you." I hugged her tightly. This was why I told the truth. Not for revenge. For reckoning. For restoration. But not everyone welcomed that truth. Jessica resurfaced not with a call, but with a public post, an open letter accusing me of distorting our family's private matters for profit. It was elegant in tone, laced with veiled hurt and performative concern. "I will always love my sister," she wrote, "even when she chooses attention over healing." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The world had seen enough curated perfection. It was hungry for something raw, real. And when the book hit the bestseller list 2 weeks later, I lit a candle on my porch, poured a glass of wine, and whispered to the stars. This one's for her. For the woman I used to be, who gave everything and got silence. You made this possible. You survived. In the weeks that followed, I received invitations from foundations, women's shelters, advocacy groups. They wanted me to speak, to write, to help shape programs for financial and emotional recovery. I was no longer just telling a story. I was building a legacy. And it had my name on it. Book signings are strange things. You sit behind a table while strangers line up to speak with a version of you they've only met through pages. They come with tears in their eyes, dog-eared copies, trembling hands. Some don't even speak. They just reach out, touch your hand, and exhale like they've been holding their breath for years. At my third signing in a small Boston bookstore, a woman in her 60s held her copy of Uncredited like a fragile artifact. "I'm not invisible anymore," she whispered. Neither was I. But back home, back in the house where my name had once been a placeholder for everyone else's failure, I remained a ghost. They didn't call. Not even when the interviews aired, or when a national morning show replayed my segment 3 times in a week. Not when the cottage was featured in a magazine article about women reclaiming space. Not when my face, solemn and proud, stared out from the book jacket that now lined the shelves of stores I'd once been too afraid to enter. Their silence was a kind of defiance, an insistence that I hadn't mattered before, and still didn't, no matter who else now thought otherwise. It didn't sting the way I thought it would. What it did instead was clarify. I no longer mistook their absence for a wound. It was a window, wide open, letting in air I didn't know I'd been missing. Still, the past has a way of circling back. One day, a letter arrived. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter, in a cream envelope, the address written in my mother's tight, schoolteacher script. I held it for a long time before opening it. Pictured her sitting at the dining table, lit by the same lamp I'd bought her 3 birthdays ago, pen pressed too hard into the paper as she wrestled with whatever truth or excuse she'd settled on. The letter read, "Elena, we've read your book. I wish things had been different. Your father still doesn't understand why you would share what you did. I don't agree with everything, but I see now how much I didn't see. I'm sorry, *. That was it. No grand gesture. No correction of the past. Just a line of apology followed by space. A white page she'd finally left blank for me to write the rest. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I drove to the Lake Clara and I used to visit in college. I sat by the shore, watching ducks scatter across the glassy water, and opened the notebook I carried everywhere now. I wrote her back, in ink as steady as my voice. Mom, I didn't tell the story to hurt you. I told it to finally hold myself. For the first time, I matter to me. If you'd like to know who I am now, not just who you remember, I'm here, asterisk. I mailed it the next day. No expectations. Just a door not locked, but no longer wide open. Let them decide what to do with it. Meanwhile, I had more stories to tell. Winter arrived earlier than expected that year, draping the cottage in soft white silence. I watched the first snow fall from my sunroom, wrapped in a wool blanket and sipping chamomile tea, marveling at how still life could be when you finally stopped living for someone else's chaos. My editor called the next morning. Oprah picked the book. I blinked. I'm sorry, what? She laughed, a high, delighted sound I would have mistaken for a prank call years ago. Uncredited is Oprah's book club pick for January. Elena, do you understand what that means? Yes. And no. Because some part of me still lived in that old living room, flinching under my father's voice, watching Jessica take credit for money she didn't even know existed. That version of me wouldn't have believed this moment. But the woman I'd become, the woman who'd spoken truth to shame and turned survival into literature, she nodded calmly. Yes, I said, my voice even. I do. Everything moved quickly after that. National interviews. Speaking engagements in cities I'd never stepped foot in. Messages from women who called themselves uncredited daughters now, proudly, as if we'd all survived some secret war. But success doesn't make grief disappear. There were nights I still dreamed of their faces, my mother's cold smile, my father's scowl, Jessica's practiced indifference. In one dream, I sat at the old family table and shouted until I lost my voice, but no one looked up from their plates. I woke up gasping. Clara came over the next morning with pastries and no questions. I want to build something, I told her. Not just talk. Something real. For women like us. She leaned in, already reading my mind. A foundation? Yes. A place that offers financial education, legal support, emotional tools. For women erased by family dynamics that feed on their silence. Clara nodded. We'll call it the ledger. The name came from one of my favorite metaphors in the book, that for some of us, life is a series of unpaid debts. Not money, but recognition, love, safety. A ledger we keep in secret, tallying what we gave and what was taken. We filed the paperwork that week. The ledger began as a whisper, an email list, a few support groups, a webinar here and there. Within months, it was a roar. Women came from everywhere, daughters, sisters, even mothers who realized too late what their own daughters had shouldered. Each story added weight. Each testimony carved out space for healing. At our first retreat, held in a borrowed cabin in Vermont, I stood in a circle of women holding candles, all of us saying the name of the person who taught us invisibility. I whispered, Richard, and blew out the flame. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like release. After the retreat, as I packed up notebooks and teacups, a woman named Carmen pulled me aside. My daughter read your book, she said. She sent it to me and said, Mom, this is what I couldn't say to you. I cried for hours. I reached out. She wrote back. Her voice shook. We're rebuilding. Slowly, but we're talking again. I smiled. That was the legacy. Not just to be heard, but to make space for others to speak, and for some to finally listen. The day the first check arrived for the Ledger's community fund, I sat in my office, yes, an actual office now, not the sunroom or kitchen table, staring at the signature like it might vanish. Anonymous donor. $50,000. No strings. Just the note. For every woman who paid in silence. I had read stories like this. Watched others cry on camera as they received miracles in the mail. I never thought I'd be the one whose life tilted because of a stranger who saw value in invisible work. Clara cried when I told her. "Do you know what this means?" she said, her voice thick with disbelief. "We can fund the emergency grants program. No more telling women to wait. No more waiting." How many nights had I waited in the past? Waited for recognition. For gratitude. For a voice to cut through the family noise and say, "We see you." Now, I could be that voice for others. We launched the Ledger Relief Initiative 2 weeks later. Emergency funding for women left stranded after family betrayals, when a mother drains the college fund for a sibling's wedding, when a daughter's income props up a parent's debts, when silence becomes the rent for staying. Applications poured in like confessions. I read every one, not as a gatekeeper, but as a witness. And then, the letter came. Not a bill, not a threat. A card, nestled in a pale blue envelope. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. Jessica. Inside, a single note. I didn't know. Or maybe I did and didn't want to. "I'm sorry." No punctuation. No signature. I placed it on my desk, beside the photo of me and Clara at the Ledger launch party, our champagne flutes raised in messy, joyful triumph. I didn't frame the card. I didn't text back. I didn't write a second book titled Forgiveness. But I didn't throw it away. Because that, too, was part of the story. Some people can't return what they took. But sometimes, they stop pretending they didn't take it. That's enough. That spring, I taught my first course, Financial Boundaries for Empaths. I stood in front of 20 women in a sunlit community center, writing terms like emotional labor and generational guilt on a whiteboard like sacred spells. They nodded. They took notes. They wept sometimes. One woman lingered after class. "My sister took credit for a decade of what I built," she said. I thought I was being petty for caring. "You weren't petty," I said softly. "You were present." That's what scared them. She smiled, tears running down her cheeks. "Thank you." No one said that to me, back when I was wiring money in secret, scrubbing their lies with my silence. But they say it now. Not because I asked to be thanked. Because I chose to be known. And once you know yourself, fully, no one can unname you again. They say healing isn't linear. That it comes in waves, sudden and strange, like old grief wearing a new dress. I understood this most deeply not in therapy, not on stages or book tours, but at a table I built with my own hands. It started as a weekend project. I wanted something new for the dining nook in my cottage, something that wasn't secondhand, something not passed down from people who only saw me in pieces. I visited a local lumber yard and spent hours running my fingers over wood planks until I found the right one: rough, unassuming, solid. Oak. A quiet strength, much like myself. I sanded it for days, varnished it with care, attached legs, reinforced the base. I'd never built furniture before, but it felt like I had. Each joint, each edge, reminded me of something internal being restored, one quiet assertion at a time. When it was done, I invited Clara over. We sat at that table with tea and leftover cake from the Ledger's second retreat. I watched the way her hands rested on the wood. Steady, comfortable. "This is the kind of table you pass down," she said. I shook my head gently. "No. This is the kind of table you invite people to who've never been given a seat." It became more than furniture. It became a gathering point. Every month, I hosted a circle of women in that tiny cottage. Some local, some who'd read the book and driven hours just to sit in a room where they could finally exhale. We called it the quiet table. We didn't tell stories unless we wanted to. We didn't solve each other's problems. We just bore witness. One woman brought photos of her childhood home and quietly burned the corners in a bowl. Another wrote a letter to her teenage self and read it aloud, trembling. Once, a woman simply wept for 20 minutes straight, and no one told her to stop. At the end of every evening, I said the same thing. You were not wrong. You were never too much. You were always enough. And I meant it. Meanwhile, the foundation grew. We received grants. We partnered with therapists and lawyers. We created toolkits and trainings for social workers to recognize the economic abuse embedded in family dynamics. It felt surreal sometimes. I used to work 2 jobs to send anonymous money home and live off instant noodles. Now, I was consulting with advocacy groups on how to break generational cycles of exploitation. But I never forgot the girl who started it all. The one who sat in her old apartment, stunned after being called a liar in her parents' living room. The one who stopped the transfers and found herself again in the silence that followed. She was still with me. She always would be. And sometimes, when no one's watching, I sit alone at the table I built and whisper to her. Look how far we came. Spring unfurled in soft greens and damp soil, and the garden I'd never had time for suddenly flourished. Clara brought me seedlings basil, mint, wild strawberries, and we spent a Sunday planting them in silence, hands dirty, hearts light. That night, the invitation arrived. No name on the envelope. No handwriting I recognized. Inside, an ivory card embossed with gold foil. Jessica Rosemore requests the honor of your presence at the launch of her new financial wellness brand, Self-Made Sister. I read it 3 times, each one slower than the last. I wasn't angry, not even surprised. Just tired. I set it down beside the candle I'd lit for peace, and I laughed. Softly, then bitterly, then not at all. The launch was scheduled to take place at the downtown hotel, the very one where I had once waited for Jessica to show up for brunch, only to find she'd forgotten and posted from a spa in Napa. The brand's tagline? Empowering women to rise, no matter their past. I almost choked on the irony. For a moment, I considered attending, walking in with my head high and my book in hand, just to look her in the eye. But that would be for her, not for me. Instead, I RSVP'd online, not attending. I didn't need to witness her performance. I'd already written the truth. It was on shelves now, passed from hand to hand like a sacred secret. Still, I wondered if she'd read my name on the RSVP list and feel anything. Regret, guilt, jealousy, or nothing at all. I didn't know anymore. What I did know was that the following week, I'd be sitting on a panel at a national conference on emotional inheritance alongside women I once thought lived in worlds far beyond mine. One of the keynote speakers, a therapist who specialized in narcissistic family dynamics, quoted my book from the stage. When love is conditional on silence, speaking becomes revolution. And the audience erupted. Afterward, a woman approached me, her hand warm and trembling. I want to stop the transfers, she said. But I'm scared. I looked her in the eye. You'll be scared. And then you'll be free. She nodded, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. I gave her my card. I gave her my time. I gave her what I never had, permission. Back home, I placed Jessica's invitation in the fire pit behind my cottage and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, curling gold foil into ash. I watched until it became smoke. Until the paper stopped pretending it was something sacred. Until it was just another thing I didn't owe. Burning that invitation didn't erase the past, but it freed me from pretending it hadn't cost me something. That's the thing no one tells you about emotional labor. It doesn't leave scars that show, but it bankrupts you all the same. I had spent too many years overdrafting my soul. Now I lived within my emotional means. Boundaries weren't walls, they were doors I decided whether or not to open. The month after Jessica's launch, I received a message from an old college roommate. We hadn't spoken in years. Hey Elena, just saw your book in a window downtown. Wow, congrats. I remember when you were working 3 jobs and still helping your family out. They must be so proud. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Thanks. It's been a journey. Funny how proud people become when the world starts paying attention. Her reply was fast. I never forgot how kind you were to me back then. You always saw the people others missed. I hope you see yourself now. That hit harder than expected. because she was right. I had learned to see everyone, read their moods, anticipate needs, soothe tensions, accept myself. I'd built entire systems around others' comfort. Meanwhile, I'd been living off emotional crumbs and calling it gratitude. Now, I made different choices. When my mother called again, weeks after her last letter, I answered. She spoke softly, carefully, the way one speaks to someone who might vanish if startled. I read your book again, she said. This time slower. I didn't speak. I didn't realize, she continued. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm listening now. I let that sit for a moment. I appreciate that, I said. But listening isn't the end. It's the start. She didn't argue. That alone felt like a shift. And then she asked something unexpected. Would you ever come visit? Just to talk? It would have been easy to say no. Safer, maybe. But I'd written 70,000 words about not being seen. Now that someone had cracked the door, I had to decide if I'd walk through. So I said, maybe. One day. And I meant it. Not as a promise, but as a possibility. That night, I sat at the table I built and drafted the opening for my next book. Not a memoir. A guide. Uncredited. The recovery workbook. Because telling the story was only half the work. Living beyond it, that was the rest. I didn't expect her to come to the retreat. I'd told my mother about it offhandedly on a cautious phone call, how we were hosting a 3-day workshop for women rebuilding their lives after financial and emotional betrayal. She'd asked quiet questions. I offered careful answers. But on the morning of the retreat, as I checked registration at the small conference center in Vermont, there she was. Standing near the back of the room, holding her coat, eyes darting between the floral arrangements and the women milling about with tote bags and nervous smiles. Mom? I asked, disbelief coloring my voice. She turned, startled, then softened. I wasn't going to come, she said. But then I thought, maybe I need to sit in the room I never created for you. We stood in silence. And then I nodded. Okay. She didn't ask to lead. Didn't ask to speak. She just signed in, picked up a name badge, and found a seat in the corner. For the next 2 days, she listened. When women shared about being guilt into giving, she closed her eyes. When one participant read a letter to the mother who had always compared her to her prettier, louder sister, my mother's hand shook around her teacup. The second night, I walked past her on the way to my room. She stopped me, hand light on my sleeve. I used to think you were unbreakable, she said. I had to be, I replied. She nodded slowly. You shouldn't have had to. The next day, during the final circle, I invited each woman to say one thing they were reclaiming. Time, someone said. Peace, another whispered. When it was my turn, I said narrative. I looked at my mother. Not to erase what happened, but to write what comes next. She didn't speak in the circle. But later, as we packed up, she handed me an envelope. I didn't know how to say this out loud, she said. But you should read it. I waited until I was alone in my cottage, surrounded by suitcases and candlelight. Inside the envelope was a check. Pay to the order of Elena Moore. Memo, back pay. For everything we pretended wasn't yours. It wasn't about the money. It was about the line. They had finally stopped pretending. I placed the check in a drawer, unsure whether I'd ever cash it. But I kept the envelope. The check sat in my drawer for weeks, tucked between folded letters and dried lavender sprigs I kept for calm. I didn't cash it. I didn't tear it up either. It wasn't about reimbursement. It was a symbol. A relic. Proof that for once, they were willing to name the truth, even if only in ink and numbers. I carried on with the work. The ledger grew, quietly but powerfully. We opened our first satellite office in Atlanta. A woman named Imani ran it, brilliant, fierce, and fluent in the language of survival. She'd grown up caring for siblings while her mother drifted through marriages and men. I thought I was a martyr, she said. Turns out I was just exhausted. She was perfect for the job. We launched new workshops on financial disentanglement, emotional boundary setting, and healing through storytelling. Each time I stood before a room, I saw the same look, recognition. A mirror cracking, then reforming stronger. One morning, I received an email from a university professor. He wanted to assign uncredited in his family psychology course. Said the students, mostly women, were hungry for stories that lived outside clinical definitions. Your book isn't just memoir, he wrote. It's a case study in truth. I gave him permission. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I visited my childhood home. Not for them. For me. I parked 2 blocks away, heart thudding as I walked the familiar sidewalk. The house hadn't changed much, same shutters, same front porch sag. But it felt smaller, less mythical. Like a set I'd once performed on, no longer in production. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She wore the same cardigan I remembered from high school. Her face was older, lined not just by time but maybe by reflection. You came, she said. I did. She didn't reach for a hug. She stepped back, letting me decide. I entered the house with careful feet, as if the past might lurch from behind the coat rack. But it didn't. The ghosts had quieted. The living room was as I remembered, family photos, a fading rug, Jessica's awards still lining the shelf. I looked at them, not with pain, but with detachment. My mother followed my gaze. I kept them up, she said. Out of habit, I guess. I didn't answer. In the kitchen, she'd set out tea. Not the kind she liked, the kind I preferred. Chamomile with honey. I read your second book, she said quietly. Oh! She looked at me. You're helping people, Elena. Really helping them. You took pain and turned it into something useful. It wasn't praise. Not exactly. But it wasn't dismissal either. We sipped in silence. At one point, she reached into the drawer and pulled out a familiar photograph, me at 8 years old, holding a handmade card with glitter stuck in my hair. I found this in the attic, she said. You made it for Father's Day. I remembered. I had drawn our family as sunflowers. Jessica's stem had been longer. Mine was bent, but blooming. I'm sorry I didn't water you enough, she whispered. I blinked. That I hadn't expected. We didn't hug. There was no dramatic reconciliation. But when I left, she said something that made me pause at the door. You're welcome back. When you're ready. I nodded. Not now. But maybe one day. Some doors aren't slammed shut. Some are just left ajar, quiet invitations to return as someone different. After visiting the house, I didn't go back for a long while. Not because I was angry, anger had burned itself out years ago, but because I finally understood that peace sometimes means choosing your own absence. I had entered, I had seen, and I had left nothing behind. No part of me lingered there now. The next season brought a kind of quiet expansion. The work deepened. The women at the Ledger began designing their own curriculums. A workshop on boundary making became a published scene. A group of survivors turned their healing into art therapy classes for others. My name was no longer at the center of everything, and that felt right. I had started the fire. Now others were tending it. Meanwhile, I turned inward. I rented a small cabin in the Berkshires for the summer, alone, to write my 3rd book. Not a guide, not a memoir, but fiction. My first novel. I wanted to tell a story where the forgotten girl didn't just survive, she transformed unashamedly. Where the arc wasn't about reconciliation, but self-recognition. A novel about legacy not defined by lineage, but by choice. I wrote longhand in the mornings, walked through forests in the afternoons, and cooked quiet meals in the evenings. It was the most solitude I'd had in years, and the most sacred. No interviews. No panels. No inbox to tend. Just a woman, a pen, and a history she no longer feared. One night, I received a letter, not from my mother this time, or Clara or a donor. From Jessica. Typed. Simple. No embellishments. Elena. I read your 2nd book. I didn't want to, but I did. I don't expect forgiveness. I wouldn't know what to do with it. I just wanted you to know I remember now. The way you looked when you used to leave for work at 5 a.m. so I could sleep in. The way you sent flowers after Dad yelled at me and pretended you hadn't heard. I don't think I ever said thank you. So, thank you, Jessica. I read it twice. Then again. There was no invitation to reconnect. No veiled request for a platform. Just a reckoning. A late blooming, perhaps. But blooming nonetheless. I didn't reply. But I folded the letter and placed it in my journal, between pages filled with fiction that was starting to sound more and more like truth. That summer, I finished the first draft of the novel. It was messy, beautiful, and utterly mine. It ended not with a dramatic reunion, but with a woman planting a garden in her own name. And that felt like enough to be why late August, the wild strawberries in my garden back home were overripe, clinging to their vines like memories waiting to fall. I returned from the Berkshires with calloused fingers, notebooks full of ink, and the kind of clarity you only earn when you disappear long enough to find yourself. The cottage smelled like lavender and thyme. I opened the windows, let the summer air chase away the dust. The place had waited for me without need, like a true home does. I walked out back to my garden. The mint had overgrown its bed, reckless and unapologetic. The basil was flowering. My hands itched to trim, to harvest, to tend. But first I sat. There, in the middle of my little kingdom of dirt and resilience, I exhaled. This was mine. Not inherited. Not borrowed. Not conditional. Planted by my hands. Grown in my name. I thought of Jessica's letter. My mother's tea. My father's silence, which had remained unbroken. Some absences are answers too. That weekend, Clara came by with a bottle of wine and news. "We've been nominated," she said, eyes glowing. "A national nonprofit award. Lifetime impact category." I blinked. "We haven't even been around a decade." "Doesn't matter. Your book, the fund, the reach, it's legacy work, Elena." Legacy. It tasted strange in my mouth. Not bitter. Not sweet. Just unfamiliar. The nomination brought press. Invitations. A flurry of attention I met with cautious joy, but amid the praise, something else arrived. An email. From a university in Connecticut. My alma mater. They were hosting an alumni panel, Paths Unscripted, Redefining Success. They wanted me to speak. The same university I'd left quietly, turning down art residencies and graduate programs because I thought I had to be near home. Because I believed, then, that loyalty meant proximity. That love meant sacrifice. That staying was synonymous with care. Now they saw me as an authority. A beacon. I stared at the screen, torn. And then I clicked accept. When I arrived on campus weeks later, the place looked both smaller and sacred. The student union still smelled of coffee and old ambition. My name tag read Elena Moore, author and founder. The panel included a venture capitalist, a social worker, and a playwright. Each shared their story, twists, pivots, stumbles. When it was my turn, I told them this. Sometimes the hardest path to walk is the one that leads away from everything you thought you owed. But it's also the only path that will take you home, to yourself. A student raised her hand at the end. "How do you forgive people who never said sorry?" I smiled gently. You stop waiting for the apology and start becoming the person who doesn't need it to move forward. That night, back at the cottage, I planted marigolds under a rising moon. A flower of the dead, of grief, but also of protection. A reminder that some ghosts we bury, and some we simply learn to walk beside. The award ceremony for the Ledger took place in a grand ballroom in Washington, D.C., all chandeliers and speeches, sequined dresses, and practiced applause. I wore a navy blue suit, understated but sharp, a quiet contrast to the shimmering gowns around me. I didn't bring anyone from my past. Not Clara, though she deserved it more than most. She insisted on staying back to manage operations. "This moment," she said, "is for the version of you who thought she had to disappear to be loved. Let her stand there alone, and let her shine." So I did. When they called my name, I walked to the podium slowly. I had practiced a speech, but when I looked out at the audience, all those unfamiliar faces waiting for a story, I let it go. I want to thank you, I began. Not just for this honor, but for the space it represents. I paused. There's a woman I used to be. She never got thanked. She gave and was told she was so strong only because no one asked how she managed to keep standing. I breathed in deeply. This is for her. And for all the women still quietly holding everyone else together. There was a hush. Not silence, something heavier. Recognition. I stepped down to applause that felt not like noise, but affirmation. Later that evening, in the hotel elevator, a woman I didn't know reached out as the doors closed. I was her too, she said. The strong one. The invisible one. Until I read your book. I nodded. You're not invisible now. She smiled, eyes shining. Neither are you. I flew home the next morning under a soft, pearl gray sky. The kind of sky that feels like a lullaby. At the cottage, Clara had left a bouquet on the table, sunflowers. A note in her curling script. For the girl with the bent stem who bloomed anyway. I stood there for a long time, fingers brushing the petals. The next few weeks were filled with plans, expanding the ledger, organizing a mentorship circle, finalizing edits on the novel. And then one rainy Tuesday, I received a message. From Jessica. Again. Just one line this time. I named my daughter after you. I stared at the screen, blinking away the fog in my eyes. Not because I forgave her, but because some names, when spoken with truth, become prayers. I didn't reply, but I whispered into the quiet, let her grow differently. I imagined a little girl, Elena, whose worth was never transactional. Who would never have to earn love by vanishing? Who would never have to wonder if she mattered? And in that imagining, something in me softened. The seasons turned again, slow and tender. Summer drifted into a crisp New England autumn, and my cottage wore red and gold like an old friend trying on joy. I began each morning the same, tea, journaling, a walk through the garden. The marigolds had faded, but the rosemary was strong, resilient, fragrant, quietly thriving. Like me, I had learned not to fill every moment, not to earn rest, not to justify solitude. It was enough to be. One afternoon, while organizing old photos for a ledger exhibit, I came across a picture of myself at 17. I was standing behind Jessica, slightly off-center, hands folded, a smile too tight for the joy it pretended to carry. I almost put it back in the box. But then I paused. I looked closer at that girl, how she had tried so hard to be easy, helpful, low maintenance. She wore other people's expectations like second skin. And still, they called her selfish when she asked for space. She was trying to survive in a family that mistook endurance for love. I framed the photo, not because I missed her, but because she deserved to be seen. Above it, I hung a mirror. Now, every time I walked past, I saw them both, the girl I was and the woman I became. Not in competition, but in conversation. One evening, I received a call from a woman named Margot. She ran a network of shelters for women fleeing financial abuse, a term still not recognized in far too many places. She'd read my book, listened to the podcast, cried through my keynote. And she had an idea. We want to create a residency program, she said. A 6-month stay where women can recover and rebuild, financially, emotionally, artistically. She hesitated. We'd like to name it after you. I was silent. Then I said the only thing that felt true. Only if it's not just about me. So we called it the Moore Haven. Not a monument. A home. The first residents moved in that winter. I visited often. Not as a founder. As a witness. I brought tea and books and listened to stories that broke me open and stitched me back together in the same breath. One woman, Miriam, handed me a drawing she'd made. It was a tree, roots tangled with names and burdens, but the branches reaching toward a full moon. "This is how I see your story," she said. "What you grew, despite." I cried in front of her. She didn't flinch. By then, I had learned, vulnerability isn't a weakness. It's the echo of surviving yourself. I left the drawing by the framed photo in my cottage. Every day now, I pass 3 women: the girl I was, the woman I became, and the one who saw the branches when I could only feel the dirt. And I remind myself, you are allowed to be seen now. You are allowed to stay.